Something very serious is about to hit the United States, and it is not a distant threat. It is already gathering force, already pressing against the foundations of our society, already demanding that we either wake up and act or stand still and face the consequences. The first truth we must face is that the United States has reached a tipping point. The country is overwhelmed by deep political polarization, an economy that serves the few while burdening the many, and a system that no longer guarantees fairness or opportunity for all. We are at risk of breaking apart not from an external enemy, but from the internal erosion of trust, justice, and shared values. The second truth is that the storms of climate and environment are no longer warnings for future generations. They are realities today. Fires, floods, hurricanes, droughts, nature is showing us that we have ignored her too long. The United States, with its vast resources and technology, should be leading the world in solutions. Instead, we are drifting, debating, while the waters rise, while the harvests fail, while communities suffer displacement. This is not tomorrow's crisis, it is today's emergency. And the third truth is the global stage itself. The United States can no longer act as though it stands apart, immune to the world's turbulence. Global conflicts, pandemics, mass migrations, the rise of authoritarian powers, all of these press against our borders, our economy, our security. If America does not act wisely with humility and courage, it risks becoming a casualty of its own arrogance, a once great nation that failed to adapt to a new age. So I tell you now, something very serious is about to hit the United States. But seriousness does not mean hopelessness. It means responsibility. It means urgency. It means that if we act with vision, with unity, with courage, we can still steer our future towards stability, justice, and peace. The warning is here. The choice is ours. The time is now. The United States today stands at a perilous crossroads, and the greatest threat to its stability is not one that comes from foreign armies or from hostile powers abroad. It comes from within. It is the corrosion of the nation's democratic foundations, the erosion of trust in institutions, the widening gulf of inequality, and the dangerous polarization that pits neighbor against neighbor. This internal breakdown, if left unchecked, will be far more destructive than any external adversary. It is a quiet, insidious unraveling, one that hollows out the country's capacity to solve problems, to imagine a common good, and to sustain the promise that America once represented to its people and to the wider world. When we look honestly at the state of American society today, what do we see? We see a nation where wealth has reached almost unimaginable levels at the very top, while tens of millions of families live paycheck to paycheck, trapped in cycles of debt, struggling to afford healthcare, education, and housing. We see a political system dominated by money, where the interests of ordinary citizens are consistently overruled by the power of corporate lobbies and billionaires who fund campaigns. We see a Congress that no longer legislates for the common good, but for the next election cycle, mired in gridlock, incapable of passing bold and necessary reforms. This is not just dysfunction, this is decay, and decay left untreated leads to collapse. The story of America has always been about promise, the promise of liberty, of equal opportunity, of a better life for one's children. Yet millions of Americans now feel that this promise has been broken. Wages have stagnated for decades while costs have soared. Young people are saddled with crushing student debt, unable to buy homes or start families. Whole communities, once sustained by industries that gave stable employment, have been hollowed out, leaving behind despair, addiction, and hopelessness. These are not isolated failures. They are symptoms of a system that has been allowed to drift away from serving the public good, a system that has chosen short-term profits for the few over long-term prosperity for the many. But perhaps the most dangerous element of this crisis is not only the inequality of wealth and power, but the inequality of truth itself. The United States is living through an age of misinformation and deliberate deception, where lies travel faster than facts, and where technology is exploited to manipulate minds rather than enlighten them. When citizens no longer share a basic reality, when half the country believes one version of events and the other half believes another, the very possibility of democracy breaks down. How can we deliberate? How can we compromise? How can we govern ourselves if we cannot even agree on what is real? This fragmentation of truth is the acid that corrodes the bonds of society, the poison that pits American against American until nothing remains but tribalism and resentment. We must also recognize the role of political polarization in deepening this fracture. For decades now, leaders have found it more useful to divide than to unite, more profitable to stoke anger than to heal wounds. Media outlets have learned that outrage sells, that fear keeps audiences hooked, that sensationalism is more powerful than substance. And so the country has been fed a steady diet of division until we no longer see fellow citizens as partners in building a shared society, but as enemies to be defeated. This is not politics as usual. This is a path towards self-destruction. Democracies do not survive long when the people lose faith in one another, when compromise is seen as betrayal, when the common good is sacrificed for the pursuit of total victory over one's rivals. The warning signs are clear to anyone willing to look. We see declining trust in government, in the media, in science, in the very institutions that are supposed to sustain society. We see declining life expectancy in some communities, fueled by opioid addiction, poverty, and despair. We see anger spilling into violence, not just in isolated acts of crime, but in mass shootings, in domestic terrorism, in threats against public officials. We see a country increasingly unable to govern itself, paralyzed by division, each side convinced that the other is not just wrong, but illegitimate. These are not minor cracks in the system. These are the tremors that precede an earthquake. The greatest danger of all is complacency. Too often Americans have been told that their democracy is exceptional, that it is unshakable, that it will endure no matter what, but history tells us otherwise. No society is immune to collapse. Rome believed it was eternal, and yet it fell. Great empires of Europe believed they would last forever, and yet they fractured under the weight of internal strife. The United States is not exempt from the laws of history. If it does not renew itself, if it does not confront its internal decay, it too will decline, not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the slow crumbling of its foundations, until one day it is no longer recognizable. Yet this moment of reckoning can also be a moment of renewal if the seriousness of the situation is understood. The United States must choose to heal itself. It must address inequality with bold reforms that put human dignity above corporate profit. It must rebuild trust in government by ending the dominance of money in politics and by showing that public institutions can deliver real results for ordinary people. It must strengthen the fabric of democracy by protecting the integrity of information, by ensuring that citizens have access to truth rather than propaganda, and by holding accountable those who profit from deception. And it must revive the spirit of unity by recognizing that America's strength has always come from its diversity, from its capacity to bring together people of different backgrounds, beliefs, and regions to work for a common future. This is not an easy path. It requires leadership that is honest, courageous, and willing to face uncomfortable truths. It requires citizens who are ready to demand more than slogans, who are willing to engage not as passive spectators, but as active participants in democracy. It requires a recognition that freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but its fulfillment. And above all, it requires the humility to accept that no nation is guaranteed success, that the future is always uncertain, and that survival depends on the choice choices we make today. Something very serious is about to hit the United States, and it is already here in the form of its internal erosion. The question is whether the nation will wake up to this reality in time. Will it allow polarization, inequality, and mistrust to tear it apart? Or will it rise to the challenge, confront its weaknesses, and rediscover the values that once made it a beacon of hope? The choice lies not in fate, but in will. And if America chooses wisely, if it summons the courage to face its own failures, it can still chart a path toward renewal, toward justice, toward a future where the promise of democracy is not broken, but fulfilled. The climate crisis is no longer a distant warning, no longer a forecast for future generations, no longer a possibility hanging on the horizon. It is here, it is real, it is escalating, and it is striking with a force that the United States can no longer afford to deny. Wildfires that consume entire towns in California and Oregon, floods that devastate the Midwest, hurricanes that grow in strength and frequency along the Gulf Coast, droughts that parch the Southwest, and rising seas that threaten coastal cities. These are not anomalies, not isolated disasters. They are the manifestations of a planet that has been pushed beyond its natural limits, of a climate destabilized by decades of human negligence, and the United States, a nation with unparalleled resources, knowledge, and capacity for leadership, stands paralyzed in the face of this emergency, drifting when it should be steering, debating when it should be acting. The science is not in dispute. For more than half a century, researchers have warned that the burning of fossil fuels, the destruction of forests, and the relentless pursuit of growth without regard for sustainability would trap heat in the atmosphere, alter weather patterns, and unleash consequences both devastating and irreversible. Those warnings were clear, those warnings were repeated, and yet, time after time, policymakers chose delay over action, denial over responsibility, profit over precaution. The result is the reality we now confront. A nation battered by disasters that grow more severe each year, a people facing costs that mount not just in dollars but in lives, and a planet inching closer to thresholds beyond which no recovery will be possible. Consider the economic toll. In recent years, climate-related disasters have inflicted hundreds of billions of dollars in damages across the United States. Insurance systems are collapsing under the strain. Homeowners are being abandoned in high-risk areas. Farmers are watching crops wither or drown, and cities are straining to rebuild again and again. This is not sustainable. A nation that prides itself on prosperity cannot thrive if its wealth is perpetually consumed by repairing the damage of preventable disasters. Yet instead of addressing the root causes, too often America settles for patchwork responses, rebuilding what has been destroyed only to see it destroyed again. The cycle is not just costly, it is irrational. Beyond the economic toll lies the human toll, which is immeasurable. Families displaced by floods lose not just homes, but communities. Children who breathe smoke-filled air during wildfire season suffer health effects that may last a lifetime. Elderly residents left vulnerable during heat waves die quietly unnoticed by a system unprepared for such extremes. The poorest Americans, those with the fewest resources to adapt, are hit hardest, facing higher risks, greater exposure, and fewer options for escape. This is not just a climate crisis, it is a moral crisis. It is the abandonment of responsibility for the most vulnerable, the betrayal of future generations who will inherit a world diminished by our failure to act. The United States should be leading the world in confronting this emergency. It possesses the technology, the wealth, the scientific expertise, and the global influence to drive a transition towards sustainability. It could pioneer clean energy systems that power the economy without poisoning the atmosphere. It could reimagine cities built for resilience rather than fragility. It could invest in agriculture that regenerates rather than depletes, in transportation that connects without polluting, in industries that create prosperity without destruction. The opportunities are vast, the benefits undeniable. Yet, what has held the nation back is not a lack of capacity, but a lack of will. Fossil fuel interests, entrenched and powerful, have spent decades sowing doubt, obstructing reform, and buying political influence. They have known the risks, often with greater clarity than the public itself. Yet they have chosen deception as their strategy and short-term gain as their compass. They have funded campaigns that deny science, campaigns that fracture public opinion, campaigns that frame the very survival of the planet as a partisan issue rather than a shared responsibility. And too many leaders beholden to these interests have allowed the nation to drift deeper into crisis. This capture of democracy by vested interests is one of the greatest obstacles to addressing climate change, for it ensures that truth is sidelined while lies dominate the political debate. But the climate crisis will not wait for politics to catch up. It moves forward with the relentless logic of physics and chemistry, indifferent to ideology or denial. The atmosphere responds to emissions, not to speeches. The oceans rise according to heat, not according to party platforms. The forests burn when dry, regardless of which politicians choose to ignore the cause. Nature does not negotiate. Nature enforces its laws with precision and with consequences that are as unforgiving as they are inevitable. That is why the window for action is closing rapidly. Each year of delay locks in more damage, more suffering, more irreversible loss. The United States faces a stark choice. It can continue on its present path, a path of hesitation, denial, and incrementalism, which leads inevitably toward greater disasters, greater costs, and greater instability. Or it can embrace a path of transformation, one that recognizes the gravity of the crisis and responds with the seriousness it demands. This means massive investment in renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, and beyond. It means phasing out fossil fuels with urgency, not in decades, but in years. It means rethinking the design of cities and infrastructure to withstand the extremes that are already inevitable. It means mobilizing the creativity of industry, the innovation of science, and the participation of citizens in a collective effort to secure a livable future. And let us be clear, this transformation is not merely an obligation, it is an opportunity. It is a chance to build an economy that is more just, more sustainable, and more resilient. Clean energy industries can create millions of jobs, revitalize struggling communities, and reduce the burden of pollution that disproportionately harms the poor and communities of color. Investments in resilience can save countless lives and prevent billions in damages. A shift towards sustainability can restore the health of ecosystems, the purity of air and water, and the stability of climate itself. This is not a sacrifice, it is a renewal. It is the chance to redefine prosperity in a way that respects both people and planet. Yet time is everything. Every year of delay means more lives lost, more communities shattered, more ecosystems pushed to the brink. The United States cannot wait for another decade of debate, for another generation to take responsibility. The responsibility is here, now, urgent. To fail is to condemn children and grandchildren to inherit a world of chaos, a world of scarcity, a world where survival itself becomes uncertain. History will not look kindly on a nation that had every means to act but chose not to. Something very serious is about to hit the United States, and in truth, it has already begun to hit. The storms, the fires, the floods, the droughts, they are not omens, they are realities. They are the opening chapters of a crisis that will define this century. The question is whether America will awaken in time, whether it will summon the courage to act decisively, whether it will transform fear into resolve and paralysis into progress. The science is clear, the warnings are clear, the solutions are clear. What remains is the choice. And if America chooses action, it can still lead the way, not only saving itself, but offering hope. to a world in desperate need of it. The United States has long carried itself with the belief that it stands apart, that its borders shield it from the turbulence of the wider world, that its power ensures immunity from the storms of history. Yet in today's interconnected age, no nation, however wealthy or militarily strong, can wall itself off from the currents that are reshaping the globe. Global instability, whether it is in the form of wars, pandemics, financial crises, refugee flows, or environmental shocks, does not stop at national frontiers. It arrives unbidden across borders in markets, in supply chains, in public health systems, and in the daily lives of ordinary people. The United States is no exception, and to believe otherwise is to court disaster, to invite decline through arrogance and complacency. Around the world, the balance of power is shifting. New centers of influence are emerging, old alliances are fraying, and the assumptions that guided U.S. foreign policy for decades are no longer reliable. China's rise as an economic and technological power has challenged the unipolar dominance that Washington once enjoyed. Russia, though economically weakened, wields disruptive power through military aggression and energy leverage. Regional powers in the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and Latin America are asserting independence from traditional Western influence, forging new partnerships and realignments. The international system itself is in flux, tilting toward multipolarity, where no single nation dictates the rules, but where cooperation, competition, and conflict intertwine in complex ways. For the United States, this reality requires a fundamental shift in mindset. The era of unilateral dominance is over. The notion that America can impose its will on the world through military might or economic coercion has proven both unsustainable and counterproductive. Endless wars in the Middle East drained resources, cost countless lives, and eroded America's standing. Over-reliance on sanctions as a tool of policy has alienated allies and pushed adversaries closer together. Attempts to treat global challenges as zero-sum competitions rather than shared threats have weakened the very coalitions needed to solve them. The world has changed, yet U.S. strategy has too often remained anchored in the illusions of the past. Consider the challenge of global conflict. Wars in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa send ripple effects across the globe, destabilizing energy markets, disrupting food supplies, fueling refugee crises, and heightening risks of escalation. The United States cannot insulate itself from these shocks. A war in Ukraine drives up fuel and grain prices in America. Violence in the Middle East sparks instability in global energy markets that affect U.S. households. Civil wars in Africa displace millions who then seek refuge, contributing to migration pressures that reverberate in Europe and eventually shape global politics, including in the United States. To imagine that such crises are someone else's problem is a dangerous illusion.
Or consider global health.
The COVID-19 pandemic revealed with brutal clarity that no nation can stand apart in a world of interconnected biology. A virus that emerged in one country spread across the planet within months, overwhelming healthcare systems, crippling economies, and taking millions of lives. The United States, despite its resources, was not spared. In fact, it suffered one of the highest death tolls. This was not only a failure of preparedness, but a failure of mindset. The refusal to recognize that global cooperation in health, science, and governance is essential to national security. Future pandemics are not hypothetical. They are inevitable. Without a profound shift in policy and perspective, the United States will once again find itself vulnerable to global shocks it cannot control. Economic turbulence is another dimension of this global interdependence. Supply chains span continents. Financial markets are deeply integrated. Energy flows cross borders. A disruption in one part of the world reverberates everywhere. A factory shutdown in Asia halts production lines in the United States. A financial crisis in Europe ripples through Wall Street. A drought in South America raises food prices in American supermarkets. Economic sovereignty in the 21st century is not a matter of walls or tariffs. It is a matter of resilience within interdependence. Yet the United States has too often treated globalization as either a tool for exploitation or as a threat to be contained rather than as a reality to be managed with foresight and fairness. The climate crisis, too, underscores this global reality. Rising seas do not stop at national borders. Atmospheric carbon does not carry a passport. Wildfires in one region affect air quality in another thousands of miles away. The displacement of populations due to environmental collapse is already creating new waves of migration that strain political systems across continents. The United States cannot solve the climate crisis alone, but it also cannot escape its consequences by retreating behind its borders. It must lead by example, not through dominance, but through partnership, recognizing that the stability of the entire planet is at stake. Perhaps most profoundly, the global shift toward authoritarianism poses an existential challenge around the world. Strongmen exploit fear, nationalism, and disinformation to consolidate power. They present themselves as alternatives to the perceived chaos and dysfunction of democratic systems. For many people, the failures of democracy, inequality, corruption, stagnation make such leaders attractive. This is not a distant problem. It reverberates in the United States itself, where democratic institutions are strained, where faith in government is eroding, where disinformation is rampant. If America fails to revitalize its democracy at home, it will lose its moral authority abroad. The defense of democracy cannot be waged only through rhetoric or foreign policy. It must begin with the renewal of democracy within the United States itself. The path forward requires humility, wisdom, and a recognition that America's future is bound to the future of the world. This means ending the illusion of unilateralism and embracing multilateral cooperation as the cornerstone of security. It means investing in diplomacy, in international institutions, in global public goods such as health, education, and sustainable development. It means acknowledging that the measure of U.S. leadership is not the fear it inspires, but the trust it earns. It also requires the courage to confront the structural drivers of global instability, poverty, inequality, environmental destruction, and corruption that fuel conflict and extremism. Military power cannot solve these problems. Bombs cannot end hunger. Tanks cannot stop a virus. Sanctions cannot halt a rising sea. Only cooperation, only shared effort, only a commitment to human dignity and sustainability can address the root causes of instability. The United States, with its resources and influence, can play a central role in this endeavor, but only if it chooses to lead with vision rather than with arrogance. To ignore this reality is to risk decline. A nation that clings to outdated notions of supremacy while the world shifts around it will find itself isolated, distrusted, and weakened. A nation that fails to prepare for global turbulence will be swept away by it. But a nation that adapts, that recognizes interdependence not as a burden but as a fact of existence, can thrive in a multipolar world. The United States has the chance to reinvent its role, not as a domineering power, but as a collaborative leader, a partner in building a stable, just, and sustainable global order. Something very serious is about to hit the United States, and it is the shock of realizing that it cannot stand apart from the turbulence of the world. Wars, pandemics, climate disasters, economic upheavals, the rise of authoritarianism, these forces are converging, shaping the century ahead. America must decide whether it will face them with arrogance or with wisdom, with denial or with humility, with division or with unity. The choice will determine not only the fate of the United States, but the fate of the world itself.